Okay, good. Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to normally our parsha class, we study the portion of the week, which God willing we'll do on Wednesday. But this week I wanted to study Megillat Esther because it's Motzei Shabbos. We're going to read the book of Esther, and on Shabbos morning we're going to read Parshas Zachor, which is in addition to Parshas Vayikra, which is the weekly Torah portion. We're going to read Zachor, which is about the obligation to remember the wiping out of Amalek, taken from the end of the book of Devarim, from the end of Parshas Kiseitze. But so today I wanted to spend some time studying the book of Esther. And before we did that, I just want to say, so the obligation to remember to wipe out Amalek, there are two mitzvos that you can only do. And we're going to I just want to look briefly at Dr. Norman Lamb's essay on this. He gave a Dvar Torah about this. I wanted to share with you because it seems like an evergreen Dvar Torah could be talking about how the threat of anti-Semitism against the Jewish world. It seems like that's an evergreen, and in fact, it's coming back. I'm curious, has anybody read the article by Franklin Foer in the Atlantic, 50 pages, the end of the Golden Age in America, about the end of the Jewish Golden Age? It's a very interesting article, and he sees a real turning point in Jewish life. And this is not a Jewish newspaper. This is a secular newspaper and secular magazine, The Atlantic, talking about the rise of anti-Semitism and about how the world has changed. I have some thoughts on that, but maybe that's for a different time. But in that context, from a spiritual perspective, we could talk about the mitzvah to remember Amalek. That there is a mitzvah to forget on Purim a little bit. There's a mitzvah of Adul Yada. The person has to become so confused on Purim until one does not know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. But at the same time, there's a mitzvah to remember. There's actually the Sheish Zechiros, the 6 commandments to remember. We have to remember the Shabbos. We have to remember the day we left Egypt. We have to remember what God did to Miriam 6 times in the Torah, in the 5 books of the Torah. There's a commandment to remember. And so we have to remember Amalek. That is one of the 6. And so let's see what Rabbi Norman Lamb says about it, and then we'll look at the book of Esther. And then after that, so that'll be for this week. We'll study the book of Esther after we read this. And then I want to tell everybody that this week in the afternoon, when we do the Rashi, we're going to do the Rashi on the book of Esther instead of the Rashi on Parshas Vayikra. But then starting next week after Purim, every day, instead of doing the Rashi on the Parsha, we're going to do the Haggadah every afternoon. We're going to study the Haggadah as preparation for Pesach for every afternoon. So, what does Rabbi Lamb say? Rabbi Lamb talks about the mitzvah. First of all, he talks about the benefits of forgetting. That one of the benefits of forgetting, quoting the Gemara, but he also quotes the Midrash Rabbah, that sometimes it's a blessing to forget. We say that it's a decree that after 12 months, the dead are forgotten from the heart. That after 12 months, God helps us forget, because if we would be walking around with the heaviness of our loved ones in our hearts, that would be overwhelming, and we wouldn't be able to move emotionally or spiritually. So therefore, it's a decree from Hashem to help us forget. But at the same time, forgetting is also seen as a terrible sin, as it states in Pirkei Avos, "Hashochech davar echad mi mishnato ma'aleh alav hakatuv ki'ilu mitchayev b'nafsho." If one forgets one thing from their learning, it says in chapter Avot 3:10, the verse looks at you as though you're responsible for your own life, your soul. And the reason is that we were, for many years, a purely oral tradition. Nowadays, we can't remember anything. And the reason why we can't remember anything is because our minds are trained not to remember, because we could just call up the aids of our computers, and in seconds we'll remember anything. But there was a time where the only way we could have the repositories of our tradition was through the oral memory, and so therefore to forget something was a sign of our weakness in that we were not exercising the parts of our brain that helped us memorize. And so now we go to the Shabbos. This Shabbos is called Shabbos Zachor, the Shabbos of remembering. We say in Devarim chapter 25, verse 17, verses 17 through 19, Zachoret asher asalacha Amalek, lo tishkach. Remember that which Amalek did to you, do not forget. But so Rabbi Lamb asked the question, how can the Torah consider it a sin to forget? I mean, normally that's the excuse. We say, oh, it's not my fault, I forgot. I'd say, did you do this? Oh, I forgot. And we say that's an excuse. But here the Torah is saying that forgetting is a tremendous sin. Forgetting is a tremendous sin. That's the question Rabbi Lamb asks. How can we say, can you imagine if every time you forget something, it's considered to be a sin? In fact, we say just the opposite. We say that if you forget to pray, then you could pray twice at the next prayer service because it's understandable that a person forgot and it's an accident. These things happen. So how come we say here that this is a sin to forget? So Rabbi Lamb cites the answer of the Chidushei Arim. He is the Ger Rebbe, Rabbi Yitzchak Meir, and he says, this is his quote, I'll quote a few. Forgetfulness often depends upon man. We're not speaking here of simple recollection of facts, but the kind of forgetfulness that implies the emptying out of the mind, the catharsis of the heart of its most basic spiritual principles, of the props of its identity. Meaning to say, it's not talking about a forgetfulness of a fact or forgetfulness of a task. It's talking about a forgetfulness of our mission in life, forgetfulness of our responsibility as human beings. And he says this kind of forgetfulness is contingent upon arrogance. It's the forgetfulness of arrogance. Like if you forget your responsibility to honor the elders, to care for the poor, you forget your responsibility to be a Jew. This is what it means to be forgetfulness. And right, Rabbi Lamb, this is a forgetfulness that comes from arrogance. It says in Deuteronomy, when you become arrogant of the heart, then you forget Hashem, who took you out of Egypt. Meaning to say, when you become arrogant, when we become arrogant, not you, when we become arrogant, we forget our destiny, which is that God took us out. We forget who we are, where we came from. We forget what we were. And so that leads to this arrogance. That's the sin of forgetfulness. We forget our mortality. We forget our insignificance in the world when we become suffused, overwhelmed with arrogance. That's what it's talking about. That's the sin of forgetfulness. And that's what we're referring to. That's the sin of forgetfulness at this time. So that's what Rabbi Lamb says. And he says the gematria of the word Amalek, which is what we're required to remember, the numerical value is Ram, which means to be conceited, supercilious, haughty. So Amalek is Ayin is 70, Mem is 40, Lamed is 30, Kuf is 100. So that comes to, I can do the math again. Ayin is 70, keep track, guys, 70 plus 40 plus 30, that gets to 140, plus Kuf is 240. Now we get to Ram, is Reish is 200 and Mem is 40, so it's the same thing. So therefore, when it means to say, what does Amalek mean? Amalek equals arrogance. And when we have arrogance, we don't have humility. That means we forget who we are and where we come from. So therefore, this is what Rabbi Lamb calls the arithmetic of the mind and character. So this is the basic idea. And the answer to this is a theme we've touched on many times. How do we defend ourselves against the sin of arrogance? How do we defend ourselves against the sin of forgetfulness? It's through the spiritual characteristic, spiritual attribute of humility, spiritual attribute of humility. If we're humble, then we'll always remember who we are and where we come from, and we'll never forget. So this is the idea of Rabbi Lamb, and the idea of Rabbi Lamb, just to summarize, is that Amalek represents the sin of arrogance, and so therefore we have an obligation not to forget where we are or who we come from, and that's really what the holiday of Purim. That's what the holiday of Purim is about, and that's what happened. He says that's really what he's implying, is that's how the Purim story came about, and this is a story, an old story of the Jewish people, that as the Jewish people assimilated into Persian, or into the territories of Achashverosh. They forgot who they were. We forgot who we were. We assimilated, and through our arrogance. So this is one of the messages of the Purim story. Let me just pause for a second and see if anybody has any comments about this.